Todos dependemos cada vez más de un pequeño número de grandes empresas globales. Monsanto controla el 90% de las semillas transgénicas en el mundo. Microsoft tiene un 88,26% de la cuota de mercado en software informático. Cada día, 150 millones de personas en todo el mundo compran un producto Unilever y ni siquiera lo sabe. McDonald's sirve más de 58 millones de comidas diarias. De las 100 economías más grandes del mundo, 51 son empresas. Los estados pierden poder al mismo ritmo que las grandes corporaciones lo ganan. La globalización ha generado un nuevo contexto que necesita nuevas reglas de juego en la sociedad del siglo XXI.
Because we live in a global village. It's a very small village. Whatever happens in Africa affects people in Europe. Whatever happens in India affects people in Australia. Whatever happens in Latin America affects people in Spain. So we have to look towards a better change.
Ahora no existen dos modelos de planificación, por así decir, de asignación de recursos, es solo el mercado y sobre todo hay una serie de países que están siendo muy importantes, muy relevantes. Y añadiría otro aspecto más, la concepción del occidente como el faro del movimiento de todos los países ya no es así. Es decir, las religiones, los países árabes, otra serie de valores y motivaciones están interfiriendo, con lo cual, bueno, pues podemos decir que el entorno, el contexto actual es muy distinto al de Bretton Woods. Ya no es de unos grandes potencias que lucharon en la guerra, sino es un mundo de verdad. Ahora sí que podemos decir que estamos hablando de un mundo.
La empresa es global, la empresa es cada vez más importante, son grandes holdings en todos los sectores económicos, ya sea la banca, los seguros, los automóviles, la aeronáutica, son grandes holdings con una implantación internacional, producen en 20, en 30 o en 90 países del mundo y las políticas nacionales se han quedado pequeñas, no les pueden influir. Los estados no tienen capacidad para intervenir sobre ellos, sobre las empresas, con sus leyes, con sus políticas fiscales, con sus leyes laborales. No pueden. Tampoco los sindicatos, porque su respuesta es una respuesta local frente a un capitalismo globalizado.
The company was originally a public entity. It was founded on the basis of trust and relations in the Roman times and then the Compagnia in Italy, based on two Latin words meaning breaking bread together. So it was based on family and trust and relationships, sharing risk for the public good in areas like building bridges or providing water for the village. Very important public purpose. As the company evolved, it got away from that and somehow became distorted into primarily about making money and a selfish relation as opposed to the public good.
Now that transnational companies are owned by largely, well, not always, but foreigners mostly, they're not interested in the contribution that company can make to a particular economy. All they're interested in is raising the price of their stock over a given period of time.
En septiembre de 1992, Soros apostó $10.000 millones contra la libra esterlina y dicen que ganó en una noche $1.000 millones. La moneda británica se hundió y acabó saliendo del sistema monetario europeo.
Today, as a matter of fact, very often the responsibility of the shareholdership is totally diluted. By that I mean that a private person invests in a fund and does not know what the fund is going to do with his money. Very often the fund will decide to invest the money in the most rewarding stock and will jump from one investment to another with information that is given to the private person, of course, or to the individuals, of course, but very often these individuals will not read or will not be concerned by what happens with their money. And so these funds will look for the highest possible return in general for the investor, but will not and absolutely not look for the highest possible social or environmental return for the society as a whole.
What the shareholder wants is to see the value of the stock going up every year. They used to think 5% was a really good return. Now that's nothing. They want 10%, 15%, even 20%, and naturally this can only be to the detriment of longer-term investment. So, of course, that is a very unhealthy phenomenon.
In recent years, we've seen in industry after industry a concentration of companies. So very few companies end up with a high market share and a high amount of power. One of my colleagues in the U.S. says that in most industries you could see only 2 or 3 major players around the world. Is this something to be worried about?
Una gran empresa hoy en día es una estructura muy compleja. Cuando las empresas actúan, hay 2 organigramas, pero en la práctica hay una estructura que no es la funcional, que es la que opera realmente en la dirección estratégica de un gran grupo. Cuando digo un grupo, estamos hablando de un grupo que posee el control, por ejemplo, en algunos casos, de 5.000 empresas. El problema jurídico y el problema formal está que va a existir un consejo de administración, que es el tenedor del control político de las 5.000 empresas, y después una estructura ad hoc, que muchas veces no es conocida, por supuesto, por el gran público, ni siquiera por los mismos empleados de las empresas.
Ya no vivimos en un mundo de naciones e ideologías, señor Bill. El mundo es un colegio de corporaciones inexorablemente dirigido por los estatutos inmutables de los negocios. El mundo es un negocio, señor Bill.
Este aumento de poder de grandes empresas las hace, diríamos, competidoras con el poder del Estado. Algunos estados, no todos, pero algunos estados son muy débiles y no están en condiciones de poner reglas a grandes corporaciones que poseen poderes no jurídicos, no políticos, pero sí enormes poderes económicos, que determinan, por lo tanto, aspectos esenciales de la vida de los ciudadanos.
No existe América. No existe la democracia. Solo existe la IBM, la ITT, la AT&T, y DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide y Exxon. Esas son las naciones del mundo hoy día.
El poder de los estados individualmente para hacer lo que se espera de ellos en cuanto a velar por los intereses de sus ciudadanos se va reduciendo cada vez más, porque el capital tiene libertad de movimiento. Y si un gobierno intenta imponerle impuestos o regularlo, el capital se irá a otra parte y ese país perderá más que si trata bien a ese capital. Así que muy a menudo el interés de la gente está subordinado al interés del capital.
Conviene destacar que estamos en la economía de la externalización, que hoy en día las empresas lo subcontratan todo, absolutamente todo.
La empresa transnacional actual, no solo la europea, sino todas, al mismo tiempo que es más potente, enormemente fuerte, sufre un proceso de concentración, pero también de desconcentración. Algunos lo han dicho con una expresión muy gráfica, que la empresa crece adelgazando. Efectivamente, sabemos que las empresas, muchas de las actividades que antes hacían ellas mismas, las descentralizan. Al mismo tiempo, este proceso externalización que es enormemente desarrollado, puede llegar a unos extremos increíbles. Puede llegar hasta el extremo que la empresa como tal se limita a ser un mero gabinete de diseño establecido en cualquier parte del mundo, en Milán o Nueva York, con unas sede central en la que se manejan los aspectos financieros, con no mucha gente, y a partir de ahí el resto ya no son la empresa.
Globalisation is accelerating this process. A new redistribution of labour in the world, a new division of production in the world. I think it's a mistake to believe that you can stop the transfer of production between countries. It is quite clear to us that countries will not retain the production they've always had. If trade unions in the 19th century had said, we're going to keep this production where it is forever, 95% of Swedish workers today would be working in agriculture. That's absurd. So jobs are going to move, investment is going to move.
Un fabricante puede utilizar la mano de obra de Indonesia, a la cual se la paga un salario miserable, y sin embargo venderá ese producto en Europa, por ejemplo, a unos precios que el trabajador de Indonesia no podrá nunca comprar el producto que él mismo ha fabricado.
The whole challenge of globalisation is to control the processes and to impose minimum regulation on those processes. So our concern is not simply that a job is done in Belgium or in India. Our problem is also under what conditions is the job done in Belgium or in India. And there, and you're quite right, the key issue is the respect of workers' rights.
Well, what you also see globally is that on one hand there is a sort of hypothesis that foreign direct investments going into developing countries will ultimately be to the benefit of people in developing countries. But on the other hand, you see that a lot of developing countries, for example, Indonesia, I would not even mention China here, but Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand are competing amongst one another to attract this foreign direct investment. So in the end, the big brand names who invest in countries like Indonesia and Thailand and the Philippines, they will be confronted with violations of often international standards. Because if a country lowers down its social and environmental standards just for the sake of attracting foreign direct investment.
Around the world in recent years, we have seen the growth of a large number of what are known as export processing zones, or something similar. These are zones in different countries, often geographically separate from national territory, where workers are employed producing purely for export. These are companies and zones which often have particular fiscal advantages. They are, in a sense, enclaves separated from the national economy.
No nos dejan organizarnos en sindicato. Una vez que se dan cuenta, despiden a los trabajadores que están organizando en sindicato y esos trabajadores quedan ya en una lista negra. Estos trabajadores no pueden conseguir trabajo en otro lugar. Ellos vienen aquí a Honduras y, bueno, son una fuerza de empleo, como la única opción que hay en Honduras de que la maquila es la única, la fuerza de empleo, el único rubro para poder salir de la situación en que se vive de desempleo en nuestro país.
Now, the problems we have with these zones are basically twofold. The first is that this production that's been undertaken there doesn't often benefit the host country very much. It benefits the capital which comes and invests there, and they take the profits away with them. The second concern that we have, and it's very much our own concern, is that the workers working in these zones very often do not enjoy the same labour legislation protections as other workers, and more often than not, they are denied the right to organise in trade unions. 80% of these workers are women. They're often very young women, and their situation is, again, as in the case of the Olympic Games, akin to 19th century sweatshops. Conditions are very bad indeed.
Este tipo de empresas multinacionales lo que hacen es crear, a través de sus órganos de gestión, estructuras jurídicas para eliminar la responsabilidad jurídica de los directores y de los tenedores de las acciones. Hay una segunda estructura que deriva la responsabilidad jurídica a paraísos fiscales. En este caso, los paraísos fiscales no se usan para ocultar dinero, que es lo que la gente cree normalmente, y que también es cierto, pero se crean para crear unidades jurídicas que eliminen la responsabilidad de la empresa principal. Y como tercero o cuarto elemento está la ingeniería contable y financiera, que se hace también a través de empresas creadas en estos paraísos financieros que permiten no solo ocultar beneficios, sino ocultar pérdidas o ocultar mercados clandestinos, monopolizados, como era el caso de Enron, donde se fijan precios de manera ilegal, en el caso de Enron, de la compra de corriente a las redes de alta tensión en el mercado mayorista.
Enron, which failed, you know the story of Enron, had over 700 companies in the Cayman Islands alone. So you can play a lot of games with that level of numbers of companies and places that you can park your money for whatever time is necessary.
El fenómeno que podemos encontrar, que nos estamos encontrando, es por una parte un problema de irresponsabilidad jurídica de, sin embargo, empresas extraordinariamente potentes y fuertes. Esa es la gran paradoja del sistema, ¿no? del sistema actual.
No lo sé, quisiera volver a oírlo.
Because we all know, if you're a lawyer, you can draw the line of responsibility wherever you want to draw it. You could draw it at corporate headquarters and have no people or simply one person managing the brand, outsourcing all the functions.
Usted es más chico que yo. De todos modos estamos de acuerdo, ¿verdad? Sí, eso sí. Entonces ponga usted su firma ahí y así el contrato será legal. Me olvidé de decirle que no sé escribir. No, es igual, la estilográfica no tiene tinta.
The tragedy of Bhopal is overwhelming to all of us at Union Carbide, and it goes without saying we have tremendous grief for those of the people involved in Bhopal. The one thing I wish I could tell you today is what happened over there. And at this point, we simply don't know.
It is right that for the extreme abuses, like the Bhopal disaster in India, now 20 years ago and more, where mass poisoning took place, many people lost their lives, still the land isn't properly returned to health and to a good environment, that nobody in that American company has ever been brought before the courts and charged with the manslaughter that led to the loss of those lives.
What I'd like to do, and I hope you can help me, is tell my wife I'm alive and well and hi, Mom, you know, like they do in the ballgame.
Anderson was freed tonight only after American embassy officials protested to the Indian government.
So in recent years, there have been allegations of human rights violations by multinationals. And I think that human rights violations are wrong regardless of who engages in them. A philosopher wrote a book called The Moral History of the 20th Century. And in that book, the philosopher, whose name I don't remember, details the human rights violations of the 20th century in a very clinical way. Governments are the big winners. Far more people were killed, were destroyed by governments than any company could ever do. That doesn't excuse companies that participate in human rights violations. But it is to say, usually when there are human rights violations, in my experience, there's collusion. There's collusion with government.
The oil company Unilever, who it was alleged were involved in forced labour, prison labour in Burma. And people have seen the Burmese monks on the streets. They know about the democracy movement in Burma. And the regime in that country building an oil and gas pipeline with an American company, and it is alleged using forced prison labour, 21st century slaves to do so.
Otro problema que existe a nivel de multinacionales y su implicación en el desarrollo de los países, podríamos decir, es que en muchos casos aparecen, y más en los últimos años, en los últimos 20, 25 años, implicaciones de empresas que participan en la financiación de conflictos, ya sean guerras civiles, ya sean conflictos armados más graves, o incluso guerras en el sentido del derecho internacional humanitario. El caso más típico ha sido, y muy conocido, son las empresas de diamantes en África, el caso de las empresas petroleras implicadas en las guerras civiles en algunos de los países africanos también.
For example, a company called Anvil Mining, which is an Australian-Canadian company. And in 2004, in Katanga province, in the southeast of the country, vehicles and other logistics from this company were used by the Congolese army in a military operation which resulted in more than 100 deaths.
I'm Chiquita Banana and I've come to say...
Últimamente apareció de una manera pública un caso que es interesante, no solo por lo que implica, sino porque es un caso reconocido ante la justicia, en este caso de la justicia norteamericana. Y nos referimos a Chiquita Brands. El 13 de marzo del 2007 reconoce ante la Fiscalía norteamericana que financió con pagos a las Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, que es un grupo paramilitar acusado en Colombia de crímenes sistemáticos de población civil, o sea, prácticamente de crímenes contra la humanidad, y de implicación en el mercado de la droga, en el mercado de la cocaína.
Like many large and small citizens and companies in Colombia, we were facing a very serious situation of security, a life-threatening situation in Colombia, to the extent that we had people massacred, we had people shot, executed in front of our employees. And these were relatively common, such situations, in the rural regions where we work as farmers in Colombia. We were forced to make payments in order to protect our employees. And that was the only reason why we made payments to both organizations of the left or organizations of the right in order to provide for the security of our employees.
Chiquita consiguió que saliera una ley por la cual ellos mismos hacían la certificación y el control aduanero en sus propios barcos. El problema está que cuando surge el problema de las AUC, queda claro que las AUC eran las que hacían la custodia de todo el sistema de carga de barcos en alta mar. Y según las declaraciones de Mancuso, no solo fue la Chiquita, sino que todas las empresas bananeras que comerciaban o que embarcaban pagaban un canon a las autodefensas, y estas usaban además esas facilidades portuarias para transportar la droga.
¿Todas les pagaron? Todas, además de Chiquita Brands. Además pagaron Del Monte y Dole, dos de las fruteras estadounidenses más conocidas del mundo.
In connection with our company's situation in Colombia, there have been press reports that our company was in some way involved in imports, illegal imports of arms, which were destined for the paramilitary organization AUC. I want to very briefly say that that is certainly not the case. That import of arms on a ship called the Otterloo was very carefully investigated by two recognized authorities. I have here the report by the Colombian authorities, which completely exonerated Chiquita employees or those of our local subsidiary, Banadex. And similarly, the same circumstances which caused great hardship and tragedy in Colombia, no question about it, was also carefully investigated by the Organization of American States. They both came to the same conclusion. Yes, there were people who were guilty, but those were not people working for Chiquita.
La policía encontró en Amalfi, Antioquia, estos 7 fusiles AKM en un operativo contra Mario Rendón, alias Don Mario, líder del grupo paramilitar llamado Héroes de Castaño. El operativo no sería muy importante si no fuera porque las armas hacen parte de un cargamento de 3.500 fusiles búlgaros que los paramilitares compraron en Nicaragua.
Fusil AK-47.
El mismo cargamento de armas que metió en problemas a la bananera Chiquita Brands porque, según las investigaciones judiciales, llegó al puerto de esa compañía multinacional en turbo a bordo de este buque, el Oterno.
Los mercados van muy bien para que los individuos persigan sus intereses individuales, pero no están pensados para preocuparse por las necesidades colectivas, como mantener la ley y el orden, la sanidad, la seguridad social, incluso el propio sistema financiero y el sistema legal. Esas cuestiones no se pueden dejar en manos del mercado.
Indudablemente hay un proceso en el cual más servicios públicos están siendo gestionados por empresas privadas, que no quiere decir que el Estado las abandone o que no las controle, supervise o se preocupe por sus objetivos, sino que los sistemas de gestión, en vez de ser pues la administración pública no solo decida qué servicios, sino que también los gestione, lo que se ha pasado en la situación actual es que cada vez más el servicio público existe, educación, sanidad, defensa, pero lo único que pasa es que hay más impacto, o podemos decir, más influencia del sector privado a través de empresas que se ocupan de algunos temas concretos.
Cuando hablamos de la privatización de servicios, generalmente se habla de la privatización del agua, de la luz, de lo que la gente conoce, digamos, básicamente. Pero en los últimos años ha habido un aspecto que es especialmente grave, porque afecta a dos cosas. Afecta a los conflictos armados en forma directa y afecta además al derecho internacional humanitario. Nosotros desde nuestra óptica entendemos que lo que se ha hecho es una privatización de los servicios militares. Esta es una política que durante el gobierno de Bush especialmente se ha agudizado a tal punto de que hoy sabemos que prácticamente en la guerra de Irak hay lo que podríamos llamar un ejército privado de empresas que han sido subcontratadas ya sea por el Ministerio de Defensa o por el propio ejército norteamericano y que actúan como fuerzas de control policial y de ocupación sin cumplir, al ser empresas privadas, por decir así, sin cumplir las normas que se le exigen a un ejército según el derecho internacional humanitario.
Hay recetas de apertura económica, de liberación económica que pueden tener sentido en las economías en los países en vías de desarrollo. Pero en muchísimos de los países del sur, de América Latina o de África, hoy plantear las recetas neoliberales clásicas se está demostrando fracasado. No se accede mejor al agua, no se accede mejor a la electricidad, no se accede mejor al gas, porque eso se esté gestionando de manera privada.
La base del fracaso es doble. Una es que ellos no pueden fijar los precios de mercado de un bien como el agua a niveles de rentas tan bajas. Segundo, trae un problema de resistencia de la población y de los sindicatos, por una cuestión elemental y muy simple de entender. O sea, toda la población de rentas bajas, o mejor no, pero que están incluso por debajo del nivel de subsistencia, o sea, de la renta de subsistencia medida a niveles de renta de esos países, pues directamente quedan fuera del servicio de agua. Eso es insoportable desde el punto de vista de un Estado, por más de un Estado de Derecho, por más que se pretenda poner las privatizaciones por encima de los derechos civiles incluso. Por lo que expliqué al principio, si el agua, aparte de ser un servicio básico, el hecho de que no exista crea problemas sanitarios que per se van a ser mucho más caros que la no distribución de agua potable. O sea, por ejemplo, en América Latina, que es el caso al que vamos a referirnos, desapareció una enfermedad como el cólera, desapareció en 1895, fue erradicada de prácticamente toda América Latina. Después de los programas de privatización volvió a reaparecer y en algunos países es casi endémica en este momento.
Lo que está emergiendo es la necesidad de introducir en los procesos y en la actuación de la empresa preocupaciones que van más allá del puro beneficio. El asunto es cómo estas preocupaciones por el respeto a derechos que se consideran derechos humanos, que están en la Declaración Universal de Derechos Humanos, cómo conseguimos que sean efectivos y reales.
Estamos frente a un verdadero conflicto frontal sobre las grandes corporaciones transnacionales y los estados. Estos aparecen interferidos en sus decisiones fundamentales, políticas, económicas y militares por organizaciones globales que no dependen de ningún Estado y que en la suma de sus actividades no responden ni están fiscalizadas por ningún parlamento, por ninguna institución representativa del interés colectivo. En una palabra, es toda la estructura política del mundo la que está siendo socavada.
It's much more than integrity and compliance. It is also what this company should add as value for the society. And what is this and that is a corporate social responsibility of a company. And that is the third dimension. It's not only anymore financial, is not only anymore environmental, but is also social.
Some people have argued that the current financial crisis will let us adopt a different model about business. I think there'll be a lot of change. There'll be a lot of new regulation. But if we don't address the fundamental problem, there'll be another crisis. I remember the crisis of social responsibility in the 1960s. And then it came around again in the 1970s. In the 1980s, it was a Wall Street scandal around insider trading in the U.S. In the 1990s, you had, at the end, the internet bubble and Enron and Parmalat and the oil for food scandal. So there's a history of scandals. What's causing the scandal? What's causing the scandal is that we don't see ethics and business as going together. You know, if I tell someone I teach business ethics, you know, it's a joke. You know, two words, you put them together, they're a contradiction. And that's the problem. We see capitalism as about pure economics, not about ethics.
Responsabilidad social de la empresa es un concepto que ha surgido en el siglo XXI como consecuencia de los cambios que configuran a la empresa, ¿no? La empresa ya no es solo un objeto de negocio. La empresa es ya cada vez más un objeto de intercambio, de comunicaciones, de intereses conjuntos, ¿no? Y en mi opinión, la responsabilidad social de la empresa es responder a esos intereses, no solo en la búsqueda del beneficio, sino en una relación honrada con todos ellos, en una relación honesta con todos ellos, consciente de que la empresa tiene cada vez más impactos medioambientales, más impactos sociolaborales, más impactos económicos y comunitarios. Una empresa decide relocalizarse y deslocalizarse, o invertir aquí o invertir allá, y la vida de una comunidad, de un pueblo entero, depende de eso.
Así que este es el futuro del hombre. Calentarse a los rayos del sol, bañarse en las claras corrientes de agua y comer los frutos de la tierra olvidando todo trabajo y fatiga. Bueno, ¿y por qué no?
Suppose I come to you and I say, look, you make great products and services. People like your products and services. They make their lives better. And furthermore, employees want to work for you. There's a long line of people who want to go to work for your firm because you treat them well. And they can be themselves, they can be engaged, they can be innovative. Suppliers want to work with you because you make the suppliers better and they make you better. It's a mutual relationship. Communities want you in their community because you're a good citizen in their community and you're making money. I think that's what social responsibility is. It's about creating value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. I've been almost jokingly calling CSR corporate stakeholder responsibility.
Our company, which is Chiquita Brands International, has adopted since 1998 something that we call corporate responsibility. And that is a very public commitment to high standards, to compliance with high standards of legal conduct, ethical conduct, social and environmental responsibility. And that means also that we expect every employee without exceptions to fully comply with those high standards.
Fundamentalmente, o discurso pela responsabilidade social começa através das empresas, né? Grandes empresas, grandes grupos multinacionais, empresários, por exemplo, no caso do Brasil, começaram a falar no tema responsabilidade social empresarial e também começaram a praticar, digamos assim, nas suas fundações, nas suas próprias empresas. Mas sempre dentro de uma discussão muito voltada para a ação social privada, né? Ou seja, um discurso onde responsabilidade social empresarial, na maioria das vezes, é sinônimo de ação social privada ou então filantropia.
Let me just tell you a story. I was once in a conference in Vienna about corporate social responsibility, and I was on a panel with business people, and I said, it seems to me that the first responsibility of a corporation is to pay its taxes. Because we know by the statistics of the OECD that transnational corporations are paying less and less tax, and this puts the tax burden on consumers, on individuals, and on local businesses, right? So the man next to me said, but I'm a tax lawyer. My job is to make sure that they pay the least tax possible. So I think corporate social responsibility is very often a mask for not doing anything.
We have also seen is that there is a phase where Henry Ford and Andrew Carnegie and other successful men, Rockefeller, actually had a strong philanthropic instinct of the same sort we're seeing today from people like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates. But what has happened is that they have recognized that corporate social responsibility goes way beyond philanthropy. That does some good, but it's sort of a patch on the problem. What's really important is for businesses and their employees and executives to internalize the values of good ethics, of respect for human rights, of the environment, so that they can actually avoid doing harm, but build products and services that do good. Do good, for example, for the 2.5 billion people in the world without access to clean water and sanitary drinking facilities.
Nós conhecemos a experiência em Gana, onde empresas de mineração naquele país, né, têm uma relação complexa de corrupção e benefícios privados em relação ao governo local e, por outro lado, um impacto fortíssimo em relação ao meio ambiente e às pessoas, aos seres humanos que vivem naquele país, né, ao ponto de cidades inteiras serem removidas porque ali se encontrou ouro no subsolo. Por exemplo, no Brasil é considerada uma boa empresa porque ajuda, faz investimentos em universidades, ajuda movimento social, mas ao mesmo tempo está matando ou destruindo vidas de sociedades inteiras na África.
The mine is up the hill. The river is within the catchment area of the mine. So what is happening is whatever spills that come from the uranium mine, people depend on the river to drink the water. So there's water contamination. People, most likely, when they drink that contaminated water, they get sick. The river drains into Lake Malawi. Lake Malawi is one of the world's freshwater bodies. What happens is fish can get, the fish will live in the contaminated water. They are dead. People will eat fish that is contaminated. At the end of the day, the whole lake gets destroyed, and all the people who depend on the lake will get sick.
What we also see very clearly is that companies are using double standards. A lot of companies, for their operations in Western Europe, they use the cleanest technologies, and they make sure that they don't pollute too much, and that might give the impression to a lot of people that actually the companies are performing well. They might do that in European countries, but then what most people, of course, don't see is that the more polluting activities of these same companies are all placed in developing countries now.
The issue of double standards have to stop. They have to comply with minimum core standards regardless of where they do it. And we see that human rights are universal and they are interdependent, which means that regardless if something is happening in Brazil or in Spain, people and businesses have to maintain a minimum core standards.
For instance, Shell, who has relatively clean oil refineries in Western Europe, they use much older technology in other parts of the world. Or for instance, the gas flaring in Nigeria. 75% of the gas in Nigeria is being flared. And this would be totally unacceptable in a country like the Netherlands or in France or in Denmark. So in these countries, they flare only a very small part. So that's these double standards we need to address, because otherwise we have a clean Europe and we have the rest of the world polluted.
Well, firstly, whatever I think as a politician, people do not trust our companies to behave ethically. A survey in the last year across 7 different industrialised states of 5,000 people found that compared with just 5 years ago, people say that companies are acting worse, that there is a race to the bottom.
Corporate social responsibility, next to just making only profit for the shareholders. And I think one important element has been that more and more companies, particularly Western companies, are not actually making products anymore. So they are selling lifestyles, like you see, like with big brand names of IKEA, for example, or Hennes & Mauritz, or Zara, or Nike, Adidas, etc. They also even saying that they are not making a product, they're not selling a product, but in fact they are selling a lifestyle. And in one way or another, they have discovered that if you sell a lifestyle, automatically you maybe get access to, let's say, the rich consumer markets, even young people who would like to spend a lot of money to buy Nike sneakers or clothing from Gap and other brands. But at the same time, companies have also realized that they become vulnerable as well. So just only making profits for the sake of profit is important. But if you sell no longer a product, but a lifestyle, you become vulnerable. Well, when, for example, that product is being accused of being made by child labor, because then automatically the whole concept of a lifestyle clashes, it stops.
In our opinion, CSR should be voluntary, because this is exactly what CSR is about. If we look at the European definition, it exactly says that CSR is dealing about things that companies can do which are going further than legislation. So the definition is exactly saying that CSR is voluntary, and it should remain voluntary.
Ce qu'on entend au niveau européen par responsabilité sociale des entreprises, ce sont des initiatives volontaires qui vont au-delà de la loi et au-delà des accords conclus avec les partenaires sociaux. Alors ça c'est quand même un élément important. Cette définition n'est pas forcément aujourd'hui si simple au plan global, hein, puisque nous sommes de plus en plus dans une économie mondialisée.
The biggest danger of all is that we come to believe that corporate social responsibility, which is voluntary action by enterprises, can replace laws, can replace collective bargaining as the proper regulatory framework for company behaviour. Now, what we need to see is a reinforcement of legislation and a reinforcement of trade union activity, collective bargaining in companies. Now, when you have that, then corporate responsibility can be an added and complementary opportunity. But we are seeing situations in which companies are saying, we don't want laws, we don't want unions, we don't want collective bargaining, leave it to our voluntary behaviour. And you can see clearly that this brings dangers with it.
But I do know the origin of the concept, and that was, we don't want regulation, we want voluntary measures, and that's always the line of business. We will do it voluntarily, but please don't regulate us.
As early as the first part of the 20th century in the United States, for example, Henry Ford had the recognition that, hey, wait a minute, if we don't pay our workers enough wages to buy the cars we're making, we're not going to have enough customers. And so that was called Fordism. He recognized the value of regulation to provide a minimum wage for his employees. Similarly, regulation has always been thought of by enlightened companies as necessary for markets to function. And so they've been able to argue for a level playing field of regulation that allows for transparent, corruption-free, fair dealing, so that they're not penalized by the bad businesses that don't play by the rules, that aren't transparent.
That companies have grown in size, they have grown in influence, they are recognized many rights under international law. The rights of foreign investors, as you know, are very well protected under a number of international instruments, and therefore the national states, the governments, may find it difficult to regulate companies by themselves. And for this reason, it was considered necessary to have regulations addressed not only to states by international law, but also to non-state actors, such as companies.
Already we've seen a proliferation of a number of mechanisms to promote corporate social responsibility globally. One good example that does exist is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. These are a set of voluntary principles that encourage corporate social responsibility and encourage companies to do the right thing, regardless of whether they're operating, particularly multinational companies.
Public authorities may also provide labels, by labeling schemes under which companies acquiring the label would agree to certain monitoring, certain verification of their practices, and that would be a condition for receiving this label. And finally, it's quite imaginable, and in fact certain countries such as France, the UK, for example, have done so, to impose on companies to report back on their social environmental performances in order to make it possible for socially responsible investment to prosper. So there are a number of tools which governments may use to make companies who behave best, who are the best in the CSR field, really be rewarded for these practices.
El debate en el que ahora estamos, en el debate de las líneas de la OCDE para multinacionales, o los trabajos de la Comisión de Naciones Unidas para Derechos Humanos y las empresas, son la evidencia de que ese mundo pequeño, de que ese mundo complejo, no podemos gobernarlo ya exclusivamente desde España o desde Estados Unidos o desde la India, sino que los problemas, las necesidades, las discusiones que tenemos son de escala global, y lo que hay que discutir es qué reglas del juego podemos compartir todos los seres humanos que vivimos en el planeta Tierra.
Standards are needed to have a framework for business with regard to human rights. For instance, we don't know exactly what to expect of a company operating in a difficult environment, in conflict zones. What are they supposed to do and not to do? So having standards and commonly accepted standards is an important step to regulate the behavior of businesses.
Señor, yo entregaré estos mandamientos a tu pueblo. Oídme, escuchadme, prestad atención. El Señor Jehová os ha dado a todos estos 15. Bueno, 10.
Well, the UN norms were the closest that anyone has come to building a regulatory framework, and they were subject to a very difficult political process. They were also subject to backlash from a number of mainstream businesses and business associations at the time. So it wasn't an easy process, but already getting corporations to talk about human rights is a big step and a step in the right direction.
The norms were not endorsed by the Council for many different reasons. I think that clearly business lobby against them.
In the United States, a lobby has to be registered with the Congress. You have to know how much money they're paying to lobby the government, and you have to know who's paying for it. In Europe, we have no such thing. We have voluntary measures up to now, so which means we know nothing. It's not transparent, and I don't think it's honest.
Washington se ha despertado hoy con la noticia que George Bush sufrió ayer un breve desvanecimiento en la Casa Blanca tras atragantarse con una galleta. Bush y el Partido Republicano se preparan para un curso político marcado por la bancarrota de una de las compañías que más les han apoyado.
There are about 35 lobbyists. So MEPs, as we call them, they are being approached by lobbyists all the time. And they sometimes have no idea who these lobbyists are. So what we need is to have, first of all, we need to have transparency. Lobbyists need to make clear for whom they're working, what issues they're working on, who is paying them, and how much money is involved in lobby campaigns. What we see in Brussels more and more is what we call front groups. So those are kind of, to the general public, it looks like it's a campaign organizations. But if you look at it more closely, then in reality it turns out that these kind of groups are completely initiated by companies. To give one example, last year there was a group who was launched which was called Cancer United, and it was presented as if it was an organization set up by patient groups and by doctors to fight against cancer. When some newspapers looked more closely into it, then it turned out that the whole group was set up by the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world.
So here we are in front of the BMW Group official office of Brussels, and we are going to congratulate them with their nomination for Worst Lobby Award 2007. I wonder what they're going to say. Congratulations, you have been nominated for, actually it's an award of lobbying.
Yes.
Because we understand that BMW has lobbied together with Porsche and also Daimler for making the targets of the amount of CO2 emissions per kilometer very weak. Yeah. And for that you have been nominated for the worst lobbyist in the European Commission, in the European Union. Yeah. And well, this is your congratulations.
Thank you very much.
As organizações se comportam de maneiras as mais diversas, desde trabalhar junto, dialogar com empresas, e algumas também têm o papel estratégico de denunciar, criticar, fazer campanhas, boicotes.
Al otro lado del mundo, en Londres, los ecologistas se vestían de esta guisa para protestar contra otra gran multinacional, la Shell. Acusan a esta compañía anglo-alemana de superar con mucho los límites de polución razonables en su factoría de Nigeria y de apoyar con su presencia a los militares en el poder.
With Friends of the Earth Netherlands, we've been campaigning against private banks such as ABN AMRO and ING, who were financing all kinds of projects that were cutting the forest in Indonesia. And after long campaigns, they have stopped doing that. And of course, everyone knows the example of the Brand Spar, where Greenpeace pushed Shell into stopping to just dump their oil rigs on the North Sea.
Multi-stakeholder dialogues that involve government, unions, NGOs, as well as businesses can have a very positive impact on making the level playing field level and then raising standards above that so that you have a virtuous cycle of continuing improvement instead of a terrible cycle of downward spiral of increasing poverty and ignorance and degradation.
A veces olvidamos que la RSE no será algo verdaderamente inapelable desde el punto de vista social para las empresas si no hay una sociedad que la demanda. Yo creo que esto es fundamental y por eso nos faltan políticas de demanda, políticas que aseguren que los ciudadanos quieren comprar con criterios de responsabilidad.
We are very concerned about the quality of media and democracy in general, and we believe there is a big problem if media or information is owned by a very few regarding plurality and access to different sources of opinions.
El consumidor tan solo actúa hoy respecto a una empresa con una actuación reactiva. Hay una empresa que hace una cosa mal porque alguien la está denunciando y yo tomo la decisión de no comprar ese producto o ese bien o ese servicio que ofrece esa pregunta. Pero hoy el consumidor aún no ha asumido que con sus decisiones de compra per se puede tener capacidad de cambiar los comportamientos de las empresas.
I think if the companies, wherever they are in the world, in developing countries or industrial countries, do not comply with a minimum set of standard and quality of governance, of social security, of environmental protection, there will be sanctions by the market.
Yo no creo demasiado en las actitudes críticas del consumidor todavía. Curiosamente, las encuestas nos dicen que la gente digamos, tiene una tendencia o una potencialidad a ser un consumidor responsable. Pero desgraciadamente me temo que seguimos comprando, como dice el refrán, bueno, bonito y barato, pero no bueno y responsable, ¿no? Me temo que todavía no.
So, on the one hand, the role of consumers has become more important. On the other hand, if we see that corporations, but also particularly Western governments, try to say corporate social responsibility should be a voluntary exercise because it is the consumer who decides, I think that they are wrong, because in the end the consumer decides regardless of working conditions, regardless of whether the product that they actually want to buy has been made under sweatshop conditions or not. Why? Because consumers often are not well informed. And sometimes consumers are confused because they see a lot of labels, fair trade labels, ethical labels, environmental labels. So in the end, the consumer says, okay, how should I decide?
The European Federation of Journalists, which is a group of journalist unions and associations, we believe that there is a big relationship between who owns the media and what's in the news. Unfortunately, because editorial independence is not always there and commercial interests are very much on the agenda of the media owners.
A lot of companies, like Walmart, the American supermarket chain, they source from 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 Chinese factories. How can you oversee this? If the company itself, like Walmart, cannot oversee this, how should the consumer in the United States or in the Netherlands make a decision upon this? So I think it's also a key message here that corporations, even when they are outsourcing a lot, should be held responsible for correct and actual information.
Well, reporting is, of course, extremely important, because a company nowadays, because of the fashion of being responsible, corporate social responsibility as we call it, it has become a fashion. And so it's easy for a company to say, well, from now on we will not work with child labor anymore. We will adhere to all the human rights. We will not have any more environmental waste. We will treat the natural resources in a correct way. And that's very easy to say. But if you don't report on what you are doing, nobody from within the company or even from without has any kind of ability to check if that is really true.
I believe that we do need regulation for mandatory social and environmental reporting so that each company has simple, clear, straightforward requirements so that to tell their consumers, their shareholders, their employees, all of us, what their performance is. They have to do it for financial auditing, for their financial accounts. Why shouldn't they do it too for their performance in society and on our planet?
General area of corporate social responsibility and the specific area of compliance with human rights norms and environmental norms is the impact that the Chinese companies and Indian companies coming on stream in globalization will have. The problem is that those Chinese companies, of course, and the Indian companies as well, don't have the same tradition of compliance with social standards and environmental standards that, say, US and European companies have. As a result, there's a real possibility that there could be a global lowering of standards with the thousands of new companies that are coming on stream from China and India.
I believe that the European Union level is extremely important. And I say this because within the EU, there is a shared culture about CSR issues. These are countries with a relatively similar level of economic development, with multinational corporations which present many similarities. And I believe that this is the level at which CSR could best be regulated. So if the EU begins by regulating CSR, it can then show the lead, perhaps bring other partners into regulating CSR at a more global level later.
Well, the European Union has now very firmly got the whole issue of corporate accountability onto the agenda. We're talking about it. But has there been anything really achieved? Not yet. That we will get Europe speaking with a stronger, firmer, more united voice in the international discussions which are taking place so that we can get tools to bring and hold companies to account in the United Nations and worldwide.
We want that company directors do not only have to maximize the profit to the shareholders, but they also have a legal obligation to take care for the environment and protect the rights of workers.
Estamos falando em construir uma nova forma de organizar a sociedade, em última instância, que modelo de desenvolvimento nós queremos para a sociedade contemporânea e para os nossos filhos e netos.
Does the current financial crisis have something to do with the way firms try to maximize value for shareholders? And do they ignore other stakeholders?
In 5 or 10 years, except from some national parks, all the forest in Indonesia will be gone. And the same will happen in countries like Brazil or in the in Congo. And it really needs to stop, otherwise we have about 10 to 20 years to go, and after that most of the forest will be gone.
What would I ask for people, for the shareholders, for the consumers in Western countries who are beneficiaries of the actions of these mining companies, that they're beneficiaries of dirty work? That people who wear gold, who wear diamonds, they're wearing dirty diamonds. That people, shareholders who are benefiting money, they're getting large dividends from their shareholding investments, that they're benefiting from dirty money. That it's time they acted responsibly. It's time they felt the plight of people in third world countries, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia.
Do you think you might join a larger organization, or do you want to stay by yourself in your own corner for the rest of your life? Or what would you like to contribute to make a world of greater justice?
Las grandes empresas transnacionales no solo atentan contra los intereses genuinos de los países en desarrollo, sino que su acción avasalladora e incontrolada se da también en los países industrializados donde se asientan. Es nuestra confianza en nosotros lo que incrementa nuestra fe en los grandes valores de la humanidad y en la certeza de que esos valores tendrán que prevalecer, no podrán ser destruidos.